The mountain man had defied society for 30 long winters, choosing solitude over the chaos of civilization. His weathered hands and hardened spirit had carved out a sanctuary in the wilderness, a place where only the howling wind knew his name. But when 10 Apache women, exiled and desperate, appeared at his doorstep seeking refuge, his isolated world would never be the same. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. João Costa stood at the edge of his porch, watching the snow blanket the rugged mountains of Minas Gerais. 30 winters had passed since he'd chosen this solitary existence, each year adding another layer to the quiet that had become his closest companion. The old rancher pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, his weathered hands, once skilled at tending crops alongside his beloved Maria, now accustomed only to the repetitive tasks of survival. Inside his modest cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. João moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had nowhere to be and no one waiting. He stirred the beans simmering in the pot, then reached for the battered Bible that had belonged to Maria. The book fell open to a well-worn page, and he traced the faded words with his fingertip, allowing himself this nightly ritual of remembrance. The mountain winds spoke their ancient language, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. These sounds had become his conversation partners. That, and the memories of Maria's laughter, that sometimes seemed to echo in the empty corners of the room. He'd grown accustomed to silence, settling in his chest like snow, cold and familiar. As the evening deepened, the blizzard intensified. The wind no longer whispered, but howled, rattling the shutters with unusual ferocity. João added another log to the fire and settled into his chair, a cup of bitter coffee warming his palms. The storm tonight was particularly vicious, the kind that swallowed travelers whole and left no trace until the spring thaw. It was then, between sips of coffee and memories, that he heard it, a sound so foreign to his ears that at first he dismissed it as a branch scraping against the outer wall, or perhaps a trick of his lonely mind. But it came again, a knock, sharp, urgent, pleading. João set down his cup, his heart suddenly racing. Human contact was rare in these parts, especially during winter storms. He reached for the shotgun that leaned against the wall, a habit born of caution rather than fear, and moved toward the door. The knocking came again, more desperate this time. For a moment, he hesitated, hand on the latch. 30 years of solitude had made him wary of change. But something in that knock, its desperation, its humanity, pulled at him. It reminded him of a time before grief had driven him to this mountain, when his door had always been open to those in need. With a deep breath, João Costa unlatched the door, preparing himself to face whatever waited on the other side. João Costa gripped his old shotgun tightly as he pulled open the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked in protest against the bitter cold. A wall of swirling snow momentarily blinded him, the wind cutting through his worn flannel shirt like a knife. When his vision cleared, he froze, stunned by the sight before him. 10 women stood huddled together on his porch, their bodies bent against the howling blizzard. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin stretched tight by hunger. Matted hair hung in frozen clumps around hollow eyes that held equal measures of desperation and determination. Their blankets, once colorful perhaps, were now sodden masses clinging to trembling shoulders, offering no protection against the mountain's fury. At the front stood a barefoot woman, her toes blue-white against the snow-covered boards. She clutched a small bundle protectively against her chest, arms wrapped around it with the fierce instinct of a mother. This was Rosa, though João wouldn't learn her name until days later. Her eyes met his with an intensity that transcended their language barrier. When she spoke, the words came out in a rasp, her voice damaged by cold and thirst. The language wasn't Portuguese. It flowed with unfamiliar rhythms and sounds that João couldn't place. He recognized it was Apache, though he'd had little contact with the indigenous people who occasionally passed through these remote mountains of Minas Gerais. Behind Rosa stood Lucia, the jagged scar along her jaw visible even in the dim light spilling from Joao's cabin. Her stance was protective, ready to defend the others despite her obvious exhaustion. The remaining women formed a tight circle, some barely standing, supporting each other in silent solidarity. Joao didn't need to understand their words. The universal language of suffering was written across their faces, in the trembling lips of the youngest, barely more than a girl, in the weathered determination of the eldest, whose frost-bitten feet had left bloody prints in the snow, in the quiet whimper that escaped from the bundle in Rosa's arms. For 30 years, Joao had chosen solitude, had embraced the emptiness left by Maria's death. Now fate had delivered these strangers to his doorstep. He hesitated only a moment before his weathered face softened. Without a word, he stepped aside, lowering his shotgun and gesturing toward the warmth of his hearth. One by one, they filed past him into the cabin, bringing with them the scent of fear and the promise of change. The last woman nodded gratefully as she crossed the threshold, and Joao closed the door against the howling wilderness, unaware that his 30 years of solitude had ended forever. The women huddled around the dying fire, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The silence in Joao Costa's cabin hung thick and heavy, interrupted only by the occasional whimper from Rosa's bundle, little Nathan, fighting against the cold that had nearly claimed them all. Steam rose from their damp clothes, filling the small space with the scent of wet wool and fear. Joao moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood trauma. He'd seen that same hollow look in his own eyes after Maria passed. He added logs to the fire, coaxing the flames higher without making sudden movements that might startle his unexpected guests. The crackling wood filled the silence where conversation should have been. "Water," he said simply, offering battered tin cups he hadn't used since his wife died. The women accepted with trembling hands, their fingers brushing his with reluctance born of distrust. Lucia, the woman with the jagged scar along her jaw, nodded her thanks, her eyes never leaving his face as she sipped. The old rancher rummaged through Maria's chest, pulling out blankets she had woven decades ago. He distributed them among the women, paying special attention to Rosa and her infant. When the young mother pulled back the bundle's wrapping to check on Nathan, Joao glimpsed the baby's face, tiny, red, but fighting. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. "Bed is there," he said, pointing to his own sleeping area. When they hesitated, he added, "For all of you. I'll stay here." The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Eventually, Rosa stood first, cradling Nathan close, and the others followed her lead. They arranged themselves on his bed and floor around it, a protective formation with the youngest and weakest at the center. Joao settled himself on a wooden chair by the door, his shotgun across his knees. He wasn't afraid of these women. What terrified him was whatever had driven them to his doorstep in such desperate condition. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and throwing snow against the glass like handfuls of salt. Through the night, he watched over them, listening to their breathing gradually deepen and slow. Occasionally one would startle awake, eyes wide with remembered terror, before recognizing the safety of the cabin and drifting back to sleep. As the blizzard raged outside, Joao realized this wasn't merely visitors seeking temporary shelter. This was something else entirely, a crack in the wall of solitude he'd built around himself for 30 winters. Whether he wanted it or not, these women and their stories had entered his life, and nothing would be the same again. The women huddled in silence around the hearth, their bodies close, but their minds seemingly distant. Joao Costa observed them from his wooden chair, noting how their eyes reflected horrors he could only imagine. Though they shared the same space, the language barrier created an invisible wall between them. Still, Some things needed no translation. Suffering was universal, and these women had endured more than their share. The youngest among them couldn't stop shaking, her thin hands trembling even as she clutched a steaming tin cup. Joao approached carefully, offering a worn blanket from his own bed. When she flinched at his approach, he simply placed it beside her and retreated, giving her the dignity of choice. By morning, he noticed she had wrapped herself in it completely, only her eyes visible above the frayed edge. The eldest woman's feet bore the cruel marks of frostbite, the skin mottled and discolored. Joao remembered similar wounds from harsh winters past. He moved slowly to his bedroom and returned with a small wooden chest, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside lay Maria's remedies, ointments she had prepared from mountain herbs and tallow. The familiar scent brought a brief, painful tightness to his chest. "Permita-me," he murmured, gesturing to the woman's feet. She studied him with wary eyes before giving a slight nod. With weathered hands that had once tended crops and livestock, Joao applied the salve with surprising gentleness. The woman winced but did not pull away, her stoicism evident in the set of her jaw. Throughout that long night, Joao moved between them, offering what little comfort his Spartan home could provide. More firewood for the dwindling flames, water for parched lips, and the quiet assurance of safety, at least for now. He slept little, his back against the cabin wall, watching over these strangers who had appeared like ghosts from the storm. Dawn arrived with no respite from the blizzard. The wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, but something had shifted inside. The silence felt less oppressive, the air somehow lighter despite the crowded space. The women stirred, some helping each other rebraid hair or adjust makeshift bandages. A few whispered in their native tongue, their voices creating a gentle rhythm that reminded Joao of flowing water. The barefoot woman, who had knocked first, approached him, her baby bundle cradled protectively against her chest. She stood before him, shoulders straight despite her exhaustion. "Rosa," she said simply, touching her chest. Joao nodded, understanding this offering of her name for the profound gesture it was, the first thread of trust. "Joao," he replied, his hand resting briefly over his heart. A faint smile touched Rosa's lips, fleeting as mountain sunshine in winter, but unmistakably real. In that moment, something fundamental changed in the cabin. A connection formed, tenuous but undeniable. The morning light filtered weakly through the cabin's frosted windows as Joao Costa tended the fire. For 3 days, the women had kept to themselves, communicating through gestures and whispers in their native tongue. On this 4th day, something changed. Lucia Cardozo, whose face bore a jagged scar that ran from her ear to her chin, approached him as he stoked the flames. The others watched silently from their makeshift beds of blankets and straw. "They came at night," she began in broken Portuguese, her fingers tracing the scar unconsciously. "Soldiers, many soldiers." Her words came slowly at first, then rushed out like water breaking through a dam. The woman described how their Apache village had been surrounded without warning, how the men were shot first, how the children were separated from their mothers. Joao listened without interruption, his weathered hands gripping his knees. Lucia explained how they had fled into the mountains with only what they could carry, how 3 of their sisters had succumbed to the cold before they found his cabin. "Our crime?" she asked bitterly. "We live, that is all." The rancher nodded, understanding more than words could convey. He had known loss too. The emptiness that followed Maria's death had nearly consumed him decades ago. "You need strength," he said simply, rising to his feet. Joan grabbed his hunting knife and headed outside to the small pen where his last goat bleated in greeting. He had been saving the animal for emergencies, and this, he decided, qualified as one. An hour later, the smell of goat stew filled the cabin. Rosa cradled baby Natan while the others gathered around the pot, their hollow cheeks and sunken eyes revealing weeks of near starvation. Juan ladled the rich broth into his collection of mismatched bowls, making sure each woman received a portion of meat. They ate silently, their trembling hands steadying with each spoonful. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a hot meal. The eldest among them, whose silver-streaked hair hung in a single braid down her back, placed her palm over her heart and nodded to João, a gesture that needed no translation. As night fell, the mountain winds howled outside, rattling the cabin's wooden frame. João retrieved Maria's old Bible from the shelf where it had gathered dust for years. He didn't read from it. He simply held it in his lap as he settled by the fire, finding unexpected comfort in the presence of these strangers who were quickly becoming something else. In the soft glow of the hearth, surrounded by the quiet breathing of 10 souls who had survived unspeakable horrors, João felt something he hadn't in 30 winters, the weight of solitude lifting ever so slightly from his shoulders. The days melted into weeks as winter's grip loosened slightly around João Costa's mountain ranch. The women, once hollow-eyed and trembling, began to regain their strength. Their bruises faded to yellowed shadows, and their movements grew more assured as they settled into the rhythms of the cabin. Rosa's infant son, who had barely made a sound during those first desperate nights, finally let out a proper cry one morning. A piercing wail that startled João from his coffee. The rancher nearly dropped his cup, but the women smiled knowingly at one another. That healthy cry meant life, resilience, hope. "Nathan," Rosa announced softly, cradling the bundle against her chest. "His name is Nathan." The other women nodded in approval, and João found himself blinking away unexpected moisture from his eyes. With the passing days, João noticed how the cabin's atmosphere had transformed. What was once the tomb of memories now hummed with quiet activity. The old rancher found himself recalling skills long forgotten, working with his weathered hands to improve their shelter. He dismantled parts of his rarely used barn, salvaging metal and stone to construct a proper stove with an oven, something his Maria had always wanted. Lucia, the woman with the jagged scar along her jaw, proved particularly helpful, her strong hands steady as they fitted pieces together. "My father built things," she explained simply when João remarked on her skill. The first time they baked bread together, the scent of it rising filled the cabin with a warmth that went beyond temperature. 2 of the older women took charge, their hands moving with practiced certainty as they kneaded dough on João's worn table. They spoke softly in their language, occasionally translating instructions through Rosa. João stood in the doorway, watching as something extraordinary happened. Laughter, tentative at first, then growing bolder, echoed off the cabin walls. He couldn't remember the last time these timbers had held such a sound. But peace was as fleeting as the winter sun in these mountains. 3 days later, while checking his perimeter as had been his habit for 30 years, João's heart sank. Fresh boot prints circled the property, not one set, but several, alongside horseshoe marks pressed deep into the softening snow. He knelt, touching the indentations with calloused fingers. These weren't the tracks of hunters or lost travelers. These were the deliberate patterns of men who didn't want to be seen, men who circled and watched before striking. The old rancher straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the shotgun slung across his back. His weathered face hardened as he scanned the tree line. Trouble was coming. After 30 winters alone, João Costa recognized its footprints all too well. João Costa trudged through the knee-deep snow, his weathered hands pointing to the distinct boot prints circling the perimeter of his ranch. Lucia and Rosa followed close behind, their breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air. The tracks told a story that needed no translation. Strangers had been watching them. "They came at night," João explained, his voice low and gravelly. "Not just passing through. They circled 3 times, studying us." Lucia's scarred jaw tightened as she knelt to examine the prints. The trauma, etched in her eyes, gave way to determination as she stood and faced the old rancher. "We stand or we vanish," she declared, her words hanging in the air like frost. Rosa nodded, instinctively clutching at her shawl, as if Natin were still wrapped within it, though the baby remained safely inside with the others. The young mother's eyes had seen too much death already. "Then we prepare," Joao replied with a grim nod. They returned to the cabin with purposeful strides. Inside, the women moved with quiet efficiency as Joao outlined their defense. The older women began sharpening kitchen knives against stones, the metallic scrape filling the room. Others stacked firewood against the lower windows, leaving only narrow gaps to peer through. Rosa filled every pot, bucket, and basin with water, for drinking, for dousing flames, for survival. Her hands worked steadily, but Joao noticed how they trembled when she thought no one was looking. Lucia organized the younger women, showing them how to barricade the rear entrance with the heavy oak table. The scar along her jaw seemed to pulse with each instruction she gave, a reminder of past violence that strengthened her resolve. As dusk fell, Joao checked his shotgun for the fourth time, counting the shells in his pocket. 6. Not enough if a large group came. He positioned himself by the door, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. No one spoke of sleep that night. The women took turns resting, but most sat in silent vigil, ears straining for sounds beyond the howling wind. The children were nestled together in the back room, a pile of blankets and shared warmth. Joao's mind drifted to Maria. 30 years ago, he had failed to protect her. The memory of her voice, her laughter, haunted him still. Now, as he sat with his shotgun across his knees, he felt the weight of new responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. The cabin creaked and settled in the cold. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of their watchers. Joao's eyes remained fixed on the door, his finger resting beside the trigger, ready. The night stretched endlessly before them. Each sound, the pop of burning wood, the whisper of a child's dream, magnified in the tense silence. Joao Costa woke to the acrid smell of smoke. He bolted upright, his weathered hands already reaching for his shotgun before his eyes fully opened. Through the frost-covered window, he saw thick black plumes rising from the direction of his old smokehouse. "Fire," he whispered, his voice hoarse with sleep and dread. The women stirred quickly. Rosa clutched Natan to her chest, while Lucia was already at the window, her scarred jaw tightening at the sight. "Not an accident," Lucia muttered, pointing toward the tree line. 3 mounted figures sat watching from the clearing's edge. Even from this distance, Joao could feel their malice. The tallest rider raised his hand in a mocking salute before wheeling his horse around. Within moments, all 3 had disappeared into the dense forest, leaving only hoofprints in the snow and the burning smokehouse as evidence of their visit. "They know we're here," Rosa said, her voice steady despite the fear etched across her face. The baby whimpered against her shoulder, as if sensing the tension filling the cabin. Joao nodded grimly. "And they'll be back." He moved with purpose now, retrieving his old revolver from beneath a loose floorboard, where it had remained hidden for years. The metal felt cold against his palm, a reminder of darker days he'd hoped never to revisit. The rancher gathered the women in a tight circle near the hearth. With patient hands, he demonstrated how to load the chamber, how to cock the hammer, how to steady their aim, despite trembling fingers. Some of the women watched with wide, frightened eyes, but others, those who had already seen too much violence, observed with grim determination. "We have limited ammunition," Joao explained, his voice low and serious. "Each bullet must count." When he finished the impromptu lesson, he turned to Rosa. Something in her eyes, a fierce protectiveness that mirrored his own, made his decision clear. Joao pressed the revolver into her hands, along with 3 precious bullets. "If you have to use it," he said, meeting her gaze directly, "don't miss." Rosa wrapped her fingers around the weapon, testing its weight. She nodded once, tucking it into the folds of her skirt. No words were necessary between them. Both understood what was at stake. Outside, the smokehouse continued to burn, sending sparks dancing against the cold morning sky. The women moved silently around the cabin, checking windows, securing doors, preparing for whatever might come next. The sanctuary João had built for himself, then reluctantly shared, was now under threat. But as he watched these women, strangers just weeks ago, move with purpose and determination, he realized they would not surrender it easily. 2 days crawled by in tense silence. The acrid smell of charred wood from the burned smokehouse hung in the air, a constant reminder of the threat lurking beyond their walls. João Costa spent his mornings checking the perimeter, shotgun slung over his shoulder, while the women took turns watching from the cabin windows. On the second night, Natan's cries turned from fussy to frantic. Rosa cradled her son, her face etched with terror as she felt the heat radiating from his tiny body. The infant's skin burned like fire beneath her fingertips. "He's dying," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't lose him too." The other women gathered around, their faces grim. Lucia placed a supportive hand on her friend's shoulder, but her eyes reflected the same fear. They had seen too many children claimed by fever in their village. João approached cautiously, his weathered hands reaching for the bundle. "May I?" he asked. Rosa hesitated, then nodded. Transferring her precious child to the old rancher's arms, he examined the baby carefully, memories of Maria flooding back. His wife had been known throughout these mountains for her healing skills. João reached for the wooden chest tucked beneath his bed, the one possession he had kept untouched since her passing. "My Maria knew remedies," he explained, voice thick with emotion as he pulled out dried herbs and small jars of ointment. Willow bark tea for the fever, pine tar steam to clear his breathing. Through the night, João and Rosa worked together. He showed her how to prepare the bitter tea, administering drops to Natan's parched lips. They created a steam tent over a pot of boiling water mixed with pine tar. Holding the struggling infant where the medicinal vapors could reach his congested lungs. The women took shifts, supporting Rosa when exhaustion threatened to overcome her. By dawn, the baby's fever broke. His breathing eased, and he finally nursed properly for the first time in days. Hope returned to the cabin, fragile as new ice on a spring morning. João stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply of the cold mountain air, a rare smile crossing his face. The rising sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. For one moment, peace seemed possible. Then he saw it, an arrow embedded in the snow just feet from the porch steps. João recognized the distinctive markings immediately. This wasn't from the men who had burned the smokehouse. This came from another Apache band. He pulled it from the snow, examining the black and red markings with a heavy heart. When Lucia joined him on the porch, her face hardened at the sight. "They found us," she whispered. "Our own people. They see us as traitors for running." João nodded grimly. They were now caught between two threats: hostile locals and the Apache who viewed these women as deserters. The mountain sanctuary had just become even more dangerous. Rosa's tears flowed freely, her shoulders shaking as she cradled Natan closer to her chest. The baby sensed his mother's distress, his tiny face scrunching up before he joined her with a soft whimper. The arrow's message had cut deeper than any blade could. They were unwanted by everyone, even their own people. Across the room, Lucia stood with her back straight, the jagged scar along her jaw seeming more pronounced in the firelight. Her eyes had hardened to obsidian. "No one wants us," she muttered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Not our own people, not the soldiers, not anyone." João Costa took the arrow in his weathered hands, studying its craftsmanship before tossing it decisively into the fire. The flames hissed and spat as they consumed the message of rejection. The old rancher lowered himself to his knees beside his battered Bible, fingers tracing the worn leather binding. For the first time since Maria had been laid to rest, he closed his eyes and prayed, not for himself, but for strength to protect these women and children who now depended on him. The cabin fell silent, except for the occasional pop from the burning wood and Rosa's quieting sobs. The other women huddled together, their faces etched with the same unspoken question: what would become of them now? As darkness settled fully over the mountain ranch, a soft knock disturbed the heavy silence. João reached for his shotgun, motioning for the women to stay back. He cracked open the heavy door, peering into the night. A thin Apache boy stood there, no older than 12, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. Without a word, he extended his arms, offering a bundle wrapped in cloth. The smell of dried meat wafted through the doorway. Before João could speak, the boy melted back into the darkness, his footsteps silent on the snow. "Wait," João called, but only the wind answered. He brought the bundle inside, placing it on the table where everyone could see. No one moved to touch it. Was this a gift of peace, a warning, or perhaps a test of their intentions? Lucia approached cautiously, circling the table like a wary wolf. "It could be poisoned," she whispered, though hunger shone in her eyes. Miguel Bernardes, who had been quietly mending a torn blanket in the corner, spoke up. "If they wanted us dead, they wouldn't waste good meat." The cabin's tension thickened as every eye fixed on the untouched bundle. Rosa wiped her tears with the back of her hand and joined Lucia at the table. "We can't live in fear forever," she said softly. João nodded, his prayer still fresh in his mind. Tonight, at least, they would not go hungry. But what message came with this midnight offering remained as mysterious as the mountain shadows themselves. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the mountain in pristine white. João Costa stepped onto his porch at dawn, coffee tin in hand, and froze. Surrounding the cabin in a perfect circle were footprints, dozens of them, pressed deliberately into the snow. They hadn't been there when he checked the perimeter before bed. "They're measuring our defenses," he muttered, setting his cup down and retrieving his shotgun from beside the door. Inside, Lucia was already awake, her scarred jaw tightening as João described what he'd found. The Apache woman nodded grimly, unsurprised. While helping Rosa change Nathan's swaddling clothes, she discovered something tucked between the folds of a blanket, a black feather with a distinctive silver tip. "It's a warning," she explained, holding it up to the morning light filtering through the cabin windows. "From the war chief." The other women gathered around, their faces solemn. Without hesitation, Lucia crossed to the hearth and tossed the feather into the flames. It curled and blackened instantly. "We will not live in fear," she declared, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This mountain is our home now." João watched her with quiet admiration. In the weeks since their arrival, he'd witnessed these women transform from desperate refugees to determined survivors. They'd organized the cabin, established routines for cooking and childcare, and even begun learning to defend themselves with whatever tools were available. As evening settled over the ranch, an unusual peace filled the cabin. Rosa hummed an Apache lullaby to Nathan, while João, surprising even himself, began singing an old Portuguese hymn his wife Maria had loved. Soon, other voices joined in, traditional Apache songs mingling with Brazilian melodies in a strange, beautiful harmony. The mountain man felt something long dormant stir in his chest. For the first time in 30 years, his home felt alive again. The sound that shattered this fragile moment was unmistakable, a woman's scream, piercing the night from somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. It came again, more desperate, punctuated by sobbing pleas for help. Rosa leapt to her feet, Natin clutched to her chest. "Someone's out there!" she cried, rushing toward the door. João moved faster, blocking her path with his arm. Their eyes met in the firelight, hers wild with urgency, his dark with suspicion. "It's a trap," he said quietly, his hand instinctively moving to the shotgun leaning against the wall. "They know we won't leave a woman to die in the cold." The screams continued, each one more heart-wrenching than the last. João felt the weight of every life under his roof, pressing against his conscience. The rancher stood frozen between compassion and caution, knowing that whichever choice he made could doom them all. João Costa stepped into the howling blizzard alone, the biting wind cutting through his wool coat. He clutched his shotgun tightly, following the desperate echoes of a woman's scream toward the tree line. The snow blinded him, but decades in these mountains had taught him to navigate by instinct. Near the edge of the forest, he found her, a woman bleeding from wounds across her back, stumbling barefoot through knee-deep snow. Her dark hair whipped wildly in the wind as she reached toward him with trembling hands. "Help," she gasped in broken Portuguese. The rancher had barely taken 2 steps toward her when the whistle of arrows pierced the howling wind. One struck the ground inches from his boot. Another sailed past his ear. Ambush. João dove forward, grabbing the woman around her waist. She cried out in pain as he pulled her against him, using his body as a shield. Bullets cracked through the air, splintering tree bark nearby. The attackers remained hidden in the shadows of the pines, but their message was clear. They wanted blood. "Hold on," he shouted above the storm, half dragging, half carrying the wounded woman back toward the cabin. Her blood left a crimson trail in the pristine snow. More arrows flew past as they stumbled through the drifts. One grazed João's shoulder, tearing his coat but missing flesh. The woman grew heavier in his arms with each step, her consciousness fading. The cabin door burst open. Rosa and Lucia rushed out, pulling them inside, while Miguel Bernardes provided cover with João's revolver. The women slammed the heavy door shut behind them, barring it with a wooden beam. "Kaya," the wounded woman whispered as they laid her beside the fire. "My name is Kaya." Lucia worked quickly, cleaning the deep arrow wounds with boiled water, while Rosa prepared poultices from the herbs in Maria's old chest. The children were huddled in the corner. Natan clutched tightly in Rosa's shawl, their eyes wide with terror. Through the night, they fought to save her. João held Kaya's hand as fever took hold, listening to her delirious whispers in Apache. Lucia translated fragments, warnings about brothers, betrayal, and a coming storm worse than any blizzard. "Brothers," Kaya whispered one final time as dawn broke, her eyes finding João's before the light faded from them forever. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire. João wrapped Kaya's body in his wife's old quilt, then ventured out alone to dig through the frozen earth. The snow fell heavily as he worked, his tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. He buried her on the eastern slope where the first sun would touch the grave. No marker, no ceremony, just a silent prayer swallowed by the endless white of winter, and a promise to protect those who remained. Dawn broke with a whisper of frost on the cabin windows. João Costa rose early as always, his joints stiff from another night of vigilant sleep. When he opened the door to gather firewood, he froze. There, nestled against the threshold, lay a small bundle wrapped in rabbit fur. João knelt cautiously, weathered hands trembling, as he pulled back the soft covering. A newborn girl, no more than days old, slept peacefully despite the morning chill. Tucked beside her was a single white feather, pristine against the dark fur. "Rosa, Lucia," he called, his voice breaking the silence. The women gathered quickly, gasping at the sight. Rosa stepped forward, her own baby Natan balanced on her hip. Without hesitation, she handed her son to Lucia and lifted the abandoned infant. "A white feather," Lucia whispered, tracing its edge with her scarred finger. "Not a threat," A gift. Rosa cradled the child against her chest. Or a test of our hearts, she said softly, to see if we would take in one of their own. The baby opened her eyes, dark as midnight, and Rosa smiled. Elisa, she declared simply. The others nodded in silent agreement. Joao scanned the tree line, searching for watchers, but saw only the indifferent pines swaying in the morning breeze. Someone had approached in the night, leaving no tracks in the fresh snow. The old rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. For 3 days, an uneasy peace settled over the cabin. The women took turns caring for both infants, washing tiny garments in melted snow and hanging them near the stove. Laughter returned, tentative but real, as they created a cradle from an old wooden box lined with scraps of blankets. But Joao's instincts wouldn't quiet. Each morning, he walked the perimeter, studying the surrounding forest. Each night, he slept with his shotgun closer. On the 4th morning, as pale sunlight crested the eastern ridge, Joao spotted them, a line of dark figures silhouetted against the sky. Dozens of men, their torches flickering despite the daylight, spears and bows clearly visible against the horizon. At their center stood a tall figure wearing an elaborate headdress, the unmistakable profile of a war chief. Joao's heart sank as he hurried back to the cabin. Inside, Rosa was singing softly to Elisa, while the other women prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge. "They're coming," he announced, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Not scouts this time, an army." Lucia's face hardened as she reached for her knife. "How many?" "Too many," Joao answered honestly. "The siege has begun." The chief was a shadow that haunted the mountains of Minas Gerais. Stories of his brutality had spread through the region for years. Men found with their throats cut, women vanished without trace. Now he circled Joao Costa's ranch like a vulture, leaving no footprints in the snow, yet somehow managing to place black feathers where they would be found. Silent promises of violence to come. Joao discovered the latest feather at dawn, placed deliberately atop Kaya's grave. The sight of it sent a cold shiver through his weathered frame that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He removed it with trembling fingers, remembering how the wounded woman had died whispering only of brothers. Had she been running from this very chief? Joao tucked the feather into his pocket, unwilling to frighten the others. Inside the cabin, Rosa and Lucia had arranged the sleeping quarters so the women and children slept in tight groups, bodies intertwined for warmth and comfort, unaware of the danger that stalked them. The young mother cradled Natan against her chest, while 2 other women kept watch over Elisa, the abandoned infant they had taken in. Their breathing created a gentle rhythm that belied the tension beyond the cabin walls. The smell of boiled milk simmered on the stove, mixing with the scent of pine from the freshly cut branches Miguel had brought in to reinforce the windows. These domestic aromas almost, but not quite, masked the strain that had settled on every shoulder within the cabin. "How many men does he have?" Miguel asked quietly, joining Zhao by the window. The former Union scout had quickly proven himself valuable, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for movement. "Impossible to know," the rancher replied, rubbing his calloused hand across his jaw. "Could be 10, could be 50. He moves them like ghosts." Lucia approached, the scar along her jaw more pronounced in the dim morning light. "We should tell the others," she said, her voice low but firm. "They deserve to know what's coming." Joao nodded reluctantly. The scarred woman was right. Keeping secrets would only make them vulnerable. He pulled the black feather from his pocket, holding it between them like evidence of a crime not yet committed. "Tonight," he agreed, "after the children sleep." Miguel checked his revolver, the metal catching the firelight. "And tomorrow?" Joao looked toward the mountains, where the chief waited. "Tomorrow we prepare for war." Joao Costa unfolded the weathered maps across the rough wooden floor of the cabin, his calloused fingers tracing possible escape routes through the mountain passes. The lamplight cast long shadows as he looked up at the women gathered around him. "We need to think about leaving," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of their situation. "The chief won't stop. I've seen men like him before." Lucia, the scar along her jaw more pronounced in the dim light, shook her head firmly. "We've run enough," she insisted, her eyes flashing with determination. "Our people died in the snow because we were running. I won't lose anyone else that way." Rosa nodded in agreement, cradling Nathan against her chest. The baby had grown stronger in recent weeks, his cries more robust, a small miracle that none of them took for granted. "I'm not asking you to run," Joao clarified, tapping the map. "I'm asking you to outlive them. Sometimes survival means knowing when to stand and when to move." The other women murmured among themselves in their native tongue, their expressions a mixture of fear and resolve. One of the older women spoke up, her Portuguese halting but clear. "This mountain gave us shelter when no one would. This is home now." Joao understood. The ranch that had once been his solitary prison had transformed into something else entirely. A sanctuary, a beginning. He nodded slowly, rolling up the maps. "Then we prepare," he said simply. As morning broke, sunlight streamed through the clouds for the first time in days, illuminating the snow-covered landscape. The women organized themselves with quiet efficiency, dividing into shifts to watch the surrounding woods. 2 women climbed to the roof, wrapped in blankets against the cold, scanning the ridgeline for movement. Lucia and Joao walked the perimeter, setting snares and tripwires that would alert them to intruders. The rancher showed her how to disguise their tracks, using branches to sweep away footprints in the snow. "My wife Maria taught me this," he explained, demonstrating the technique. "She always said preparation wasn't fear, it was respect for what might come." Inside the cabin, Rosa taught the younger women to melt pine resin for makeshift torches, while others sharpened kitchen knives on whetstones. The sound of metal against stone created a steady rhythm that somehow calmed them all. By midday, they had transformed the ranch into a fortress of sorts, humble but deliberate. Joao watched them work with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in decades. "We may not win," Lucia said quietly, coming to stand beside him at the window, "but we will not disappear without a fight." The old rancher nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line where he knew their enemies waited. The mountain had taught him patience, and now it would teach them all about endurance. The night descended upon Joao Costa's mountain ranch with a weight that pressed against the cabin walls. Outside, the darkness was broken by dozens of torches flickering along the ridgeline, 100 or more points of light that spelled certain danger. Inside, the women huddled close, their faces illuminated by the hearth's glow as they took turns watching through the narrow windows. It was Tanita, one of the quieter Apache women, who first heard the whimper. She had ventured to the edge of the property to check their water supply when she discovered a small bundle tucked between rocks. A child, no more than 5 years old, lay beaten and abandoned, his tiny body bruised and shivering in the mountain cold. "Joel! Rosa!" Tanita called as she carried the boy into the cabin. Everyone gathered around as they laid him on a pallet near the fire. His face was swollen, one eye sealed shut, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Who would do this to a child? Lucia whispered, her scarred jaw tightening with anger as she helped clean his wounds with water warmed on the stove. The elderly rancher shook his head solemnly, reaching for Maria's old chest of remedies. Together with Rosa, he applied ointments to the boy's bruises, while the other women prepared a thin broth, hoping to coax some strength back into his frail body. "We'll call him Cassio," Rosa decided, cradling her own son Natan in one arm while stroking the newcomer's matted hair with her free hand. No one questioned her. Names had power here, and this one seemed to fit the resilient spirit they could sense beneath his injuries. That night, Joao tossed in his sleep near the door, tormented by visions of fire consuming the cabin, of children's screams piercing the smoke, of blood staining the snow crimson. He woke with a start, heart hammering against his ribs, to find the cabin quiet except for labored breathing. Little Elisa, the infant girl who had appeared on their doorstep weeks earlier, burned with fever in Rosa's arms. Her tiny face flushed scarlet, her swaddling blankets soaked through with sweat. "She needs willow bark," Joao murmured, remembering how he had saved Nathan with the same remedy, "and fresh water from the river." The women exchanged worried glances. The river lay beyond their defensive perimeter, through woods likely crawling with scouts from the war chief's band. "I'll go," the old man said, taking up his shotgun. He slipped on his worn leather boots and moved toward the door. Rosa caught his arm. "The torches, they're watching." Joao nodded grimly. "Then I'll be quick." He slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness, moving with the stealth of a man who had spent 30 winters learning the mountain's secrets. The baby's life depended on it, and in his heart, Joao knew he would rather die trying to save her than live with another loss. Joao Costa stood frozen, his weathered hands clutching the precious willow bark and water. 3 Apache warriors had materialized from the forest shadows, their faces painted with ochre stripes. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly raised his empty palm in a gesture of peace. "For the child," he said simply, his voice steady despite his fear. The warriors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. The tallest one stepped forward, studying Joao's face with piercing eyes. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded once and reached into a leather pouch at his waist. Joao tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead, the warrior produced a small bundle of dried herbs tied with sinew and a beautifully carved wooden rattle. "Medicine," the warrior said in halting Portuguese. "For fever, for child." Joao accepted the gifts with both hands, bowing his head in gratitude. The warriors melted back into the forest without another word, leaving him stunned by this unexpected act of mercy. When he returned to the cabin, Rosa rushed to meet him, her eyes wild with worry. "Elisa?" he asked, handing her the herbs and water. "Still burning," she whispered, leading him to where the infant lay swaddled in blankets near the hearth. Lucia examined the herbs with knowing fingers. "These are powerful medicine," she murmured. "My grandmother used these." She quickly prepared a tea, adding the willow bark Joao had risked his life to collect. Through the night, they took turns cradling Elisa, spooning tiny amounts of the medicinal tea between her parched lips. By dawn, the child's fever had broken. Her tiny chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, her skin cool to the touch. "She will live," Rosa announced, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the baby to her chest. The cabin filled with quiet joy as the news spread among the women. Even young Cassio, who had not spoken a word since they found him beaten and abandoned, seemed to respond to the shift in energy. That evening, as they gathered around the fire, the boy suddenly pointed to himself. "Cassio," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Then he pointed to Elisa in Rosa's arms. "Irmã, sister." He looked at Nata next. "Irmão, brother." The silence that followed was profound. Joao felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain, but a fullness he hadn't experienced in decades. Later, after the children were asleep, the rancher spread his tattered maps across the floor. The women gathered around, their faces solemn in the flickering light. They all knew what this meant. Planning an escape route, choosing where to run next, Joao traced the mountain paths with his finger, then looked up at the circle of faces that had become his family. "We stay," he said simply. No one argued. The bitter wind sliced through the valley, but inside Joao Costa's cabin, warmth prevailed. The hearth glowed with persistent flames, devouring anything that could burn. That evening, Joao reluctantly added a chair he'd carved in his first year on the mountain, a wedding gift for Maria. He watched it catch fire, memories turning to ash. But when Rosa placed her hand on his shoulder, he found peace in the sacrifice. As winter's grip loosened, the children blossomed. Natan, now crawling with determination, chased after Cassio, who had taken to building small traps from twigs and string. Elisa, though still small, had developed a hearty laugh that echoed through the cabin. The women had established routines, Lucia teaching the younger ones to weave baskets from pine needles, others tending to the surviving goats or mending clothes. One evening, as dusk painted the mountains purple, Joao spotted a figure limping across the clearing. He raised his shotgun, squinting against the fading light. The stranger stumbled, one hand raised in surrender, the other clutching his side. "Name yourself," Joao called, voice rusty from disuse. "Miguel Bernardes," the man answered, his breath visible in the cold air. "Former Union scout. I mean no harm, just need shelter for a night." Lucia appeared at Joao's side, knife hidden in her sleeve. "We have children here," she warned. Miguel nodded weakly. "I understand." Been tracking game for 2 days. Fell down a ravine. He revealed a bloodied shirt beneath his coat. "One night. Then I'll move on." Joao exchanged glances with Lucia and Rosa, who stood in the doorway with Natan on her hip. After a moment's deliberation, he lowered his weapon and gestured toward the cabin. That night became 2, then a week. The former scout proved useful, chopping firewood despite his injury, showing the women how to set better snares, even mending the barn door that had hung crooked all winter. His presence added a layer of security that Joao, now in his 70s, couldn't deny they needed. Miguel kept to himself mostly, speaking little of his past, but the children gravitated to him. He carved a small wooden horse for Cassio and fashioned a rattle for Elisa from hollowed wood and dried beans. "Why stay?" Joao asked one evening as they repaired the roof. Miguel paused, hammer mid-swing. "Been wandering since the war. Never found a place worth stopping." He looked toward the cabin where laughter spilled from the windows. "This place, it has something I've been looking for." Joao nodded, understanding. Their fragile community had become something precious. A family forged in hardship, growing stronger with each passing day. The night of the blood moon cast an eerie crimson glow across the mountain ranch. Joao Costa discovered the broken feather pinned to the cabin door just before sunset, a warning that needed no translation. "They're close," Miguel Bernardes muttered, his weathered face tightening as he examined the feather. The former Union scout had seen enough tribal signals to recognize the imminent threat. Tonight will be the night. Inside the cabin, Lucia gathered the women around the hearth, distributing knives and instructing them on defensive positions. Her scarred jaw set with determination as she caught Joao's gaze across the room. No words passed between them, but their shared resolve was palpable. Rosa clutched baby Natan to her chest, singing softly while preparing a hiding place beneath the floorboards for the children. "If anything happens," she whispered to Elisa and Cassio, "stay silent as stones." As darkness deepened, the first distant beats of war drums echoed through the valley. The rhythmic pounding grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. Joao loaded his shotgun methodically, the familiar weight of the weapon steadying his trembling hands. "They're trying to frighten us," Miguel said, checking his revolver. "Make us panic." Outside, the drumming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise, a vacuum filled only by the sound of their own breathing and the soft crackle of the dying fire. The attack came with a sudden, terrible fury. A flaming arrow arced through the night sky, embedding itself in the cabin's roof. Within seconds, more followed. Joao and Miguel positioned themselves at the door and single window, firing at shadowy figures that darted between trees. Inside, the women fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. When 2 warriors broke through the back wall, Lucia met them with a kitchen knife, her movements swift and decisive. Rosa wielded a burning log, the flames illuminating her face as she drove back an attacker. The battle raged through the night. Gunshots and screams tore through the darkness. Blood spattered across the wooden floor that had known 30 years of solitude before these women arrived. In the chaos, little Cassio crawled from his hiding place. The boy, once abandoned and left for dead, spotted a warrior creeping up behind Miguel. Without hesitation, he pushed a heavy pot into the attacker's path. The warrior stumbled, giving Miguel precious seconds to turn and fire. "Obrigado, pequeño guerrero," the scout gasped, lifting the child to safety. Hour by brutal hour, they defended their makeshift home, not just a cabin anymore, but a sanctuary forged in blood and hope. João felt Maria's presence beside him as he reloaded, her memory giving him strength when his old body threatened to fail. The mountain that had witnessed his isolation now bore witness to his stand, not alone, but surrounded by a family he never expected to find. The morning sun crept over the mountains, casting long shadows across João Costa's battered homestead. The attackers had vanished, like ghosts, into the forest, leaving behind only trampled snow and blood-stained earth. The cabin stood defiant despite its broken windows and scorched walls, a testament to the resilience of those within. Inside, the survivors gathered around the hearth, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Rosa cradled both Nathan and Elisa to her chest, humming a soft melody that seemed to calm the infants despite the chaos they had endured. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now held a steely determination that matched the set of her jaw. "We should check for stragglers," Miguel Bernardez suggested, his scout's instincts still sharp despite the gash across his forehead. The former Union man limped toward the door, shotgun balanced against his hip. Lucia rose from her place by the fire, the scar along her jawline more pronounced in the morning light. "I'll join you," she said, picking up one of the knives they had used to defend themselves. The two nodded at each other, allies forged in battle. João watched them go, his weathered hands still trembling slightly from the night's exertion. Across the room, young Cassio sat guard over 3 of the women who had suffered injuries, offering water from a tin cup with a gentleness that belied his traumatic past. "You saved us all," one of the women whispered to João, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The rancher shook his head. "We saved each other," he replied, his voice rough from shouting commands throughout the night. By midday, they had begun repairs. The women worked alongside João and Miguel, patching walls and gathering what could be salvaged from the barn. Children collected firewood under Lucia's watchful eye, their small hands contributing to the collective effort of rebuilding. As the sun began its descent, João climbed the small rise behind his cabin, a spot where he had often stood alone, speaking his sorrows to the wind and to the memory of Maria. Now he surveyed the valley below with different eyes. The land bore scars much like its inhabitants. Burned patches, broken fences, upturned earth. But it remained. For 30 winters, João had known only solitude and grief. Now, watching Rosa teach Cassio how to properly wrap Elisa's blanket, seeing Lucia and Miguel reinforcing the door together, hearing laughter mix with the evening breeze, he recognized something he had fought forever lost: home. This was no longer just his mountain, his ranch, his burden to bear alone. It had become something greater, a sanctuary built not of mere wood and stone, but of shared struggle, mutual protection, and unlikely bonds. In the heart of these mountains, amid loss and hardship, they had created something that neither bullets nor arrows could destroy: a family.